Telling an abused person that they only get one parent can actually intensify the grief, because perhaps that's precisely the tragedy. They only had one, and that one did not protect them. If you are a parent listening to me, hear me clearly. Your child's dependence on you is temporary, but what you do with that period can echo for decades. There is a window in which your child cannot simply replace what you are meant to provide. Access to another adult's life is not something biology guarantees forever, regardless of behavior. Relationships have responsibilities. If you repeatedly destroy safety, you may eventually lose closeness. That principle is obvious in friendships. It is obvious in romantic relationships. It is obvious in workplaces. Yet, strangely, when family is involved, some people believe the normal rules of human dignity should disappear. Do not assume that because they are quiet, they are unaffected. And never assume that because they depended on you today, they will emotionally depend on you forever. Children grow. They remember. They adapt, and eventually they acquire something they did not have when they were small: choice. The relationship you have with your adult child will often be influenced by what happened when they had no choice but depend on you. Sometimes the adult child is grieving somebody who is still alive. You are not necessarily grieving their death. You may be grieving the relationship you never had. You can become 40 years old and still occasionally grieve something your 8-year-old self desperately needed. Not because you are childish, because some losses cannot be recovered simply by growing older. Money cannot buy you the 7th birthday again. An apology at 60 cannot go backwards through time and hold that frightened 10-year-old. A relationship today may create something new, and sometimes that new relationship can become meaningful, but it cannot literally rewrite history. This may be difficult to hear, but biology can create connection. It cannot manufacture a history that never happened. Someone can miss the parent they wished they had while wanting nothing to do with the parent they actually experienced. So, before you accuse someone of dwelling in the past, ask yourself, what if this is the first time they have ever felt safe enough to look at the past? We sometimes put all the moral responsibility of repairing the relationship on the person who was injured, and then call that person difficult when they cannot carry it. That is backwards. There is something we desperately need to talk about. And I know this conversation will make some people uncomfortable, but sometimes discomfort is necessary. Because somewhere in the world right now, there is a grown man or woman being called bitter because they finally found the courage to talk about what happened to them as a child. Someone is being called ungrateful because they established a boundary with a parent who repeatedly harmed them. Someone is being told, but that's still your mother. That's still your father. Family is family. Why can't you just forgive and forget? Why are you still talking about it? It happened years ago. Stop living in the past. And perhaps the most painful one, are you sure it was really that bad? And I want to ask a question. Why are we sometimes more uncomfortable with the victim speaking about the abuse than we are with the fact that the abuse happened? Think about that. Why does the person who finally speaks become the problem? Why does their silence make everybody comfortable, but their truth suddenly make everybody uncomfortable? Why do we sometimes demand emotional maturity from the wounded person while demanding almost no accountability from the person who created the wound? Because this is where we need to change the conversation. A family title is not a license to cause harm. We have romanticized certain words. Mother, father, brother, sister, uncle, aunt, family. These are beautiful words, powerful words. But titles describe relationships. They do not automatically describe character. Giving birth to someone does not make it impossible for you to abuse them. Being someone's father does not make you incapable of abandoning them. Sharing somebody's blood does not make you incapable of destroying their sense of safety. And one of the reasons many victims struggle to speak is precisely because society has created such idealized pictures of family that people cannot imagine cruelty existing inside them. A mother couldn't possibly do that. Yes, some mothers can. A father couldn't treat his own child like that. Some fathers do, but that's their family. Exactly. And sometimes that is what makes the wound so devastating, because harm from a stranger can teach you that a particular person is dangerous, but harm from the people who were supposed to protect you can teach a child something much more frightening, that even love may not be safe. The person who was supposed to become your shelter becomes the person you need shelter from. The person whose footsteps should make you feel safe becomes the footsteps you fear hearing. The person whose voice should calm you becomes the voice that makes your body tense. And then the child grows up, right? People see an adult, but they don't see everything that adult had to survive in order to become one. Children do not experience neglect as a philosophical idea. We sometimes talk about childhood neglect too casually. Their father wasn't really around. Her mother had problems. They had a difficult childhood. But imagine experiencing that as a child. A child doesn't sit there performing sophisticated psychological analysis. They don't necessarily think, my parent lacked emotional maturity and is therefore unable to provide consistent attachment and care. The child asks much simpler questions. Why don't they want me? What did I do? Why am I not worth staying for? Why does everybody else's parents show up? Why am I frightened in the place where I am supposed to feel safe? And sometimes, what is wrong with me? That is why childhood wounds can travel. A child can grow taller while carrying the same question. They can graduate carrying it, get married carrying it, become successful carrying it, raise children carrying it, walk into boardrooms carrying it, smile in photographs carrying it. Because adulthood does not automatically erase childhood. Age changes. The nervous system does not simply receive a notification on someone's 18th birthday saying, childhood complete, trauma deleted. Human beings don't work that way. You see, sometimes survival looks like independence, and then something remarkable happens. The abandoned child survives. The neglected child learns. The child who was repeatedly disappointed stops waiting at the emotional window. They build a life, right? Perhaps other people loved them. Perhaps grandparents helped. Perhaps siblings did. Teachers, mentors, friends, or partners became safe people. Maybe faith carried them. Perhaps therapy helps them understand themselves. Perhaps they became the person for themselves that nobody was for them. Perhaps they simply learned painfully how to survive. Whatever happened, life slowly grew around the empty space. Not necessarily because the wound disappeared, but because human beings can adapt. And this distinction matters. Adaptation is not evidence that the injury never happened. Sometimes the strongest looking person in the room became strong because weakness was never safe. Sometimes the extremely independent adult learned independence because depending on somebody once came with disappointment. Sometimes the person who says, don't worry, I'll handle it, learned very early that nobody was coming. And this is where something deeply complicated can happen. 20 years pass, right? 30 years pass, 40 years pass. The parent becomes older. The parent becomes lonely, perhaps frail, perhaps ill, perhaps suddenly aware of mortality. And now they want a relationship. Now they want phone calls. Now they want visits. Now they want Christmas together. Now they want photographs with the grandchildren. Now they want care. Now they want the emotional intimacy they never cultivated. And sometimes the expectation is, I am your mother. I am your father. I am your uncle. I am your auntie. But the adult child is quietly thinking, where was the meaning of that title when I needed it most? Where was the meaning of that title when I needed it most? You cannot demand the harvest of a relationship you refuse to plant. This may be difficult to hear, but biology can create connection. It cannot manufacture a history that never happened. Closeness is built, trust is built, safety is built, shared memories are built, relationships are built. You cannot repeatedly refuse to plant those things during someone's childhood and then arrive decades later demanding their harvest. You cannot abandon the field and return years later angry that somebody else cultivated it. And no, this does not mean people can never change. They can, right? Parents can regret what they did. People can become sober. People can receive treatment. People can mature. People can confront terrible things about themselves. People can apologize. People can transform. And where genuine transformation happens, something beautiful may eventually become possible. But even genuine remorse does not give somebody the authority to dictate the injured person's healing's timetable. An apology can be offered immediately. Trust cannot be demanded immediately. A person who broke the bridge does not get to stand on the opposite side shouting, "Why haven't you crossed yet?" Rebuilding takes time, and sometimes the bridge cannot be restored to what it once might have been. That is painful, but consequences are not necessarily revenge. Sometimes consequences are simply what remains after choices have been made. And then they say, but that's your mother. Whenever someone says, but that's your mother, I want us to learn to ask another question. What kind of mother was she to that child? When someone says, but that's your father, ask, what kind of father was he when that child depended on him? And sometimes we use titles to erase behavior, and we shouldn't. Being someone's parents should not lower the standard by which serious abuse is judged. If anything, the relationship explains why the betrayal may have cut so deep. A child cannot simply leave. A child often has no money, no transport, no independent home, no legal power, no emotional framework for understanding what is happening. Their survival may depend upon the very adult hearing them. Think about how terrifying that can be. And then decades later, society may look at that former child and ask why they have complicated feelings toward the person responsible. Of course, the feeling may be complicated, right? But how could they not be? Love can exist beside anger. Grief can exist beside relief. Compassion can exist beside boundaries. Someone can miss the parent they wished they had while wanting nothing to do with the parent they actually experienced. Two seemingly contradictory emotions can both be true. Why are you still talking about it? This sentence does enormous damage. Why are you still talking about it? Because perhaps they were never allowed to talk about it when it was happening. Because perhaps everybody told them to keep the family's business inside the family. Because perhaps they spent 20 years wondering whether what happened counted as abuse. Because perhaps they were threatened. Because perhaps they were financially dependent. Because perhaps they were terrified nobody would believe them. Because perhaps every time they tried to speak, somebody says, your mother loves you. Your father tried his best. You were a difficult child. Every parent makes mistakes. And yes, every parent makes mistakes. But there is a difference between ordinary human imperfection and sustained abuse. There is a difference between losing your temper and terrorizing a child. Between struggling financially and financially neglecting and exploiting someone. Between making parental mistakes and systematically humiliating, neglecting, manipulating, controlling, abandoning, or harming a child. We must stop using the fact that nobody is perfect to excuse behavior that was profoundly destructive. Imperfection is human. Abuse is not something we should normalize under the banner of imperfection. We also need to stop confusing disclosure with bitterness. Talking about something does not necessarily mean somebody is trapped inside it. Sometimes talking is how people finally make sense of it. Trauma can involve memories, emotions, and bodily reactions that do not always feel neatly organized into a past tense story. A person may intellectually know that happened 20 years ago, right? And still discover that certain situations activated fear, shame, anger, hypervigilance, or grief. That doesn't mean every difficult reaction is trauma. And it doesn't mean repeatedly discussing pain is the only path to healing. Healing can involve many things: safe relationships, reflection, therapy, faith, boundaries, grief, meaning making, and sometimes simply being believed. But for some people, being able to finally say, this happened to me, can matter enormously, because abuse often creates secrecy, and secrecy can create shame. And when someone finally names what happened, they may be doing something they were unable to do as a child, giving language to an experience they once had to survive in silence. So before you accuse someone of dwelling in the past, ask yourself, what if this is the first time they have ever felt safe enough to look at the past? And then comes the second wound, invalidation. There is the original wound, and then sometimes there is another wound created by what happens when the person speaks. They tell someone, and here, I don't believe you. You are exaggerating. There must be another side. She would never do that. Your father loves you. Maybe you are remembering it incorrectly. Why are you trying to destroy the family? Now think about what the victim hears underneath those sentences. Your pain is less believable than the preferred image of your family. That can be devastating. And this is one reason disclosure can require extraordinary courage. Some people have spent years rehearsing the sentence before they ever say it loud. Some have questioned themselves. Some have minimized what happened. Some protected the reputation of the very person who harmed them. Some kept quiet because they knew speaking would split family into camps. And when they finally speak, instead of asking, what happened? We sometimes begin interrogating their credibility. Of course, serious allegations should not automatically be treated as proven merely because they are spoken. Truth matters, context matters, evidence matters where factual determinations must be made. But there is an enormous difference between carefully establishing facts and instinctively dismissing someone because the alleged abuser happens to be their parent. We can listen without conducting a public trial. We can respond compassionately without pretending we personally know every fact. We can say, I am sorry you experienced that. I am listening. Sometimes that is where humanity begins. Family reputation should never matter more than a person's safety. You see, some families have an unwritten constitution. Rule number 1, protect the family's image. Rule number 2, never embarrass your elders. Rule number 3, never expose what happens inside this house. Rule number 4, forgive quickly, especially when the person who harmed you has status. Rule number 5, if telling the truth threatens family harmony, silence the person telling the truth. But understand this, silence is not the same thing as peace. A family can look peaceful because one person has been forced to swallow all the pain. Everybody can smile at Christmas dinner while somebody at that table is carrying memories nobody's permitted to mention. That is not necessarily reconciliation. Sometimes that is simply silence with decorations. Real healing cannot be built upon compulsory denial. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. This distinction could free somebody listening to me right now. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not identical. Different cultures, religions, and individuals understand forgiveness differently. For some, forgiveness means releasing revenge. For others, it means refusing to allow hatred to dominate their life. For some, it is spiritual. For others, the word itself is not useful to their healing. But whatever definition you use, forgiveness does not automatically require unrestricted access. You can forgive somebody and still say, you cannot speak to me like that. You can forgive and still say, you cannot live in my house. You can forgive and still decline a phone call. You can forgive and require supervised contact. You can forgive and say, I love you, but I cannot have the relationship you want. And in severe circumstances, somebody may decide that no contact is the safest boundary available. That decision should not be made casually, but neither should outsiders casually demand reconciliation when they did not live through the harm. Because reconciliation requires participation from both sides. Healthy reconciliation normally requires something the word forgive is too often used to bypass: accountability. So where is the accountability? Where? Now, imagine this. A parent causes years of harm. The child eventually creates distance. Everybody approaches the child saying, forgive. But who approaches the parent and says, take responsibility? Who says, listen without defending yourself? Stop rewriting what happened. Do not demand immediate trust. Respect the boundary. Apologize without adding but. Accept that your child may never have the relationship with you that you now want. Demonstrate change consistently. Understand that regret does not erase consequences. We sometimes put all the moral responsibility of repairing the relationship on the person who was injured and then call that person difficult when they cannot carry it. That is backwards. If reconciliation is genuinely desired, responsibility cannot rest entirely on the wounded person's ability to tolerate more. And then they say, I am sorry, what more do you want? Sometimes quite a lot more. Because remorse is not merely a sentence. An apology matters, but meaningful repair often looks like, I acknowledge what I did. Not, I am sorry you feel that way. It looks like, I will not minimize it. Not, it wasn't that serious. It looks like, I will not make you comfort me because I feel guilty about hurting you. It looks like, I understand why you don't trust me. It looks like, I will respect the boundaries you need. It looks like, I will demonstrate change whether or not I receive the relationship I want as a reward. That last one is crucial because sometimes what looks like remorse is actually negotiation. I apologized, therefore you owe me access. No, an apology is not a receipt you hand someone in exchange for intimacy. You see, sometimes the adult child is grieving somebody who is still alive. This is another part people don't understand. Estrangement can involve grief, profound grief, but it is a strange kind of grief because the person may still be alive. You are not necessarily grieving their death. You may be grieving the relationship you never had, the birthday call that never came, the graduation they missed, the affection you watched other children receive, the protection you needed, the apology you may never hear, the childhood you cannot repeat. You can become 40 years old and still occasionally grieve something your 8-year-old self desperately needed. Not because you are childish, because some losses cannot be recovered simply by growing older. Money cannot buy you the 7th birthday again. An apology at 60 cannot go backwards through time and hold that frightened 10-year-old. A relationship today may create something new, and sometimes that new relationship can become meaningful, but it cannot literally rewrite history. And accepting that can itself be part of grief. And parents need to understand this too. If you are a parent listening to me, hear me clearly. Your child's dependence on you is temporary, but what you do with that period can echo for decades. There is a window in which your child cannot simply replace what you are meant to provide. They need safety, presence, protection, guidance, affection, consistency. They need to know that home is where the nervous system can rest. And yes, parents are human, right? Parents get things wrong. Parents struggle. Parents can be poor, overwhelmed, traumatized themselves, depressed, anxious, unsupported, immature. But your own wounds do not make your child's wounds imaginary. Explanation is not the same thing as absolution. If your childhood damaged you, you deserve compassion for that. But if that damage then became harm inflicted upon your child deserves compassion too. Pain can explain behavior without making harmful behavior acceptable. And if years later your child creates distance, do not begin the story at the boundary. Ask what happened before the boundary existed. Sometimes the boundary is not the beginning of the story. Sometimes boundary is the final chapter of a story everybody refused to read. This is perhaps the most important thing I want people to understand. Distance is not always revenge. Sometimes distance is regulation. Sometimes distance is safety. Sometimes distance is the only way somebody who has discovered to stop the old relational pattern from continuing. There is a major difference between saying, I want you to suffer, and saying, I cannot continue suffering in order to keep you comfortable. Those are not the same sentence. A boundary is not automatically hatred, and access to another adult's life is not something biology guarantees forever, regardless of behavior. Relationships have responsibilities. If you repeatedly destroy safety, you may eventually lose closeness. That principle is obvious in friendships. It is obvious in romantic relationships. It is obvious in workplaces. Yet, strangely, when family is involved, some people believe the normal rules of human dignity should disappear. They shouldn't. They shouldn't. But they are old now. Yes, an aging deserves dignity. Illness deserves compassion. Frailty deserves humanity. But someone's age today does not erase another person's childhood yesterday. This is where things can become morally and emotionally complicated. An adult child may choose to care for an aging parent who failed them. Another may provide financial assistance but maintain emotional distance. Another may arrange practical care without becoming the primary caregiver. Another may rebuild the relationship slowly. Another may decide they cannot safely re-enter the relationship at all. These situations are deeply individual. We should be very careful about sitting outside somebody's history and deciding what sacrifice proves they are a good child. You may know the elderly parent. You may not know what it cost that child to survive them. People say you only have one mother, you only have one father, as though scarcity automatically makes something safe. Yes, you may only have one biological mother. That does not tell us what happened in the relationship. And telling an abused person that they only get one parent can actually intensify the grief, because perhaps that's precisely the tragedy. They only had one, and that one did not protect them. To the person who survived it, now, I want to speak directly to you, the person listening who knows exactly what I'm talking about. Perhaps you have spent years wondering whether you are cruel for needing distance. Perhaps your family calls you difficult. Maybe you've been accused of breaking the family apart. Maybe you are the one who stopped attending gatherings. Maybe people described you as unforgiving because they never saw what happened behind closed doors. Maybe you've even asked yourself, am I exaggerating? Am I remembering incorrectly? Was it really that bad? Shouldn't I be over this by now? Your experiences deserve to be taken seriously, and healing does not have to look like pretending nothing happened. Healing can involve learning to remember without allowing the memory to control every part of your present. It can mean learning what safety feels like, learning what healthy love looks like, learning that saying no does not automatically make you cruel, learning that guilt and wrongdoing are not always the same thing. Sometimes people feel guilty simply because they were trained to believe that having boundaries was disrespectful. Healing may also mean examine your own patterns honestly, because surviving harm does not make any of us incapable of harming others. Part of breaking cycles is refusing to reproduce what injured us, and that is powerful. Not merely saying, look at what they did to me, right? But eventually being able to say, what happened to me will not become what I do to somebody else. This is how cycles begin to break. Your healing does not need to look like anybody else's. Some people eventually reconcile. Beautiful. Some rebuild a limited relationship. Some forgive but remain distant. Some need years before deciding anything. Some discover that permanent separation is necessary for their safety. There is no universal script, and nobody watching from outside should pressure a survivor into contact merely because reconciliation makes the observer feel more comfortable. Where reconciliation is safe and genuinely desired, it can be extraordinary. But forced reconciliation is not healing. A photograph is not reconciliation. Sitting at the dinner table is not reconciliation. Calling someone mom is not reconciliation. Calling someone dad is not reconciliation. Reconciliation requires reality, and reality begins with truth. Now, to families who know what happened, if someone comes to you with a painful story about their childhood, you do not have to become judge and jury overnight. But please, do not immediately become defense counsel for the family image either. Listen, ask thoughtful questions. Do not gossip about their disclosure. Do not rush to confront people without considering the victim's safety. Do not force meetings. Do not say, for my sake, can't everybody just get along? Sometimes everybody getting along means asking the most wounded person to become silent again. And please understand, neutrality is not always neutral when one person has significantly more power than another. Sometimes the most humane thing you can say is simply, I hear you. You didn't deserve to be harmed. What do you need from me right now? And if you genuinely do not know what to say, don't fill the silence with words that deepen the wound. Sometimes quiet compassion is better than careless advice. And if you are the parent who was absent, if you are the parent who caused harm, if you are now older now and finally understand what you lost, there may still be something you can do. But begin with humility, not entitlement. Don't return saying, I am your parent, therefore you owe me. Return saying, I understand that my choices affected you. Don't say, that was years ago. Say, I understand that years passing does not automatically repair what I did. Don't say, how long are you going to punish me? Ask, what boundaries do you need in order to feel safe? And perhaps the hardest sentence of all, I hope one day we can build something different, but I understand that I'm not entitled to the closeness I failed to build. That is humility. That is accountability. And strangely enough, accountability may create more possibility for genuine repair than entitlement ever will. Because you cannot return to a childhood that has already ended. This is the tragedy at the center of all of this. The parent may return, but the child they abandoned is gone. There is now an adult standing there, an adult who learned to survive, an adult who built relationships, an adult who learned how to pay bills, solve questions, soothe themselves, find belonging, and make decisions without the person whose presence they once desperately needed. And sometimes the returning parent expects to step directly into the place they left empty decades earlier. But life may already have grown there. Other relationships may have grown there. Faith may have grown there. Self-reliance may have grown there. Grief may have grown there. Wisdom may have grown there. Sometimes walls grew there too. You cannot simply announce, I am ready to be your parent now, and expect time to reverse itself. The question is no longer, does this child need me? The question becomes, can this adult trust me? Those are completely different questions. This is why prevention matters. Parents, love your children while they are children. Be present while your presence can shape their world. Listen while they still run to tell you everything. Protect their trust before they learn to stop giving it to you. Apologize when you hurt them. Do not humiliate them because you have authority. Do not use money as a weapon. Do not make affection conditional upon obedience. Do not turn children into emotional punching bags for wounds they did not create. Do not force them to become adults because you refuse to behave like one. Do not assume that because they are quiet, they are unaffected. And never assume that because they depended on you today, they will emotionally depend on you forever. Children grow, they remember, they adapt, and eventually they acquire something they did not have when they were small. Choice. The relationship you have with your adult child will often be influenced by what happened when they had no choice but depend on you. So the next time somebody tells you they have a difficult relationship with their parent, resist the temptation to immediately say, but that's your mother, they know. That's your father, they know. You need to forgive. You may have no idea what their healing requires. Instead, ask, what happened? And then listen, because some people are carrying stories they have never been allowed to finish telling. Some are carrying wounds hidden underneath extraordinary success. Some became comedians because making everybody laugh was easier than explaining why they cried. Some became caretakers because they learned that love meant earning your place. Some became fiercely independent because dependence once felt dangerous. Some struggled to trust affection because affection once came with conditions. And some appear completely fine because human beings can function while hurting. Never mistake functionality for the absence of pain. And one final thing, if you harmed your child and your child survived you, built a life, found peace, created boundaries, and learned to live without what you should have provided, do not interpret their independence as proof that your absence did not matter. Sometimes their independence is evidence of how much it mattered. Do not return years later demanding the emotional reward of parenting when you rejected the emotional responsibility of parenting. You can ask, you can apologize, you can change, you can make amends where possible, you can offer something different, but you cannot demand. Because love demanded is not intimacy. Forgiveness demanded is not forgiveness. Silence demanded is not peace. And reconciliation demanded is not reconciliation. If the door ever opens again, walk through it with humility, not ownership. And to society, stop asking wounded people to bleed quietly so everybody else can remain comfortable. Stop protecting titles more than people. Stop treating boundaries as betrayal. Stop calling every disclosure bitterness. Stop asking survivors to pretend their childhood didn't happen because the truth makes the family uncomfortable. And stop measuring somebody's goodness by how much mistreatment they are willing to tolerate from people who share their blood. Sometimes healing looks like reconciliation. Sometimes healing looks like forgiveness. Sometimes healing looks like therapy. Sometimes healing looks like grief. Sometimes healing looks like rebuilding. And sometimes healing looks like finally saying, I will not hate you. I will not spend my life trying to destroy you, but I will also not destroy myself just to prove that I have forgiven you. There is a difference. And perhaps if we understood that difference, fewer survivors would spend their adulthood feeling ashamed for protecting the person nobody protected when they were a child themselves. So before you tell somebody that is still your mother, before you tell them that is still your father, before you tell them family is family, blood is blood, remember this: a title tells you who the person was supposed to be. The survivor story tells you who they actually experienced. And sometimes those are two different people. Listen before you judge, because you do not know what it cost somebody to survive a home everybody thought was normal. And you certainly do not know what it cost them to finally speak.